Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Victor Cha, Senior Vice President and Korea Chair at CSIS, and it's a wonderful day to be celebrating the new book, Patterns of Impunity, Human Rights in North Korea and the Role of the U.S. Special Envoy by Robert King. Robert King, Senior Advisor and Adjunct Fellow with us here at CSIS in the Korea Chair. We can go now to the screen of the speakers, please. So good to see everybody, and it's really a pleasure to have everyone here. The way we're going to do this is we're going to ask Roberta Cohen to speak first to talk about her impressions of the book and questions for Bob, and then we'll go to Bob to respond, and then we'll go to National Assemblyman, the Honorable Ji Seong-ho, who is it's late in Seoul, and we are very grateful that he was able to join us. But please allow me to introduce everybody formally first. Of course, our guest of honor, Robert King, served as Special Envoy for North Korean human rights issues at the U.S. Department of State. He was nominated by President Obama, confirmed by the U.S. Senate, and served in that role from November 2009 to January 2017. He led the U.S. efforts to press North Korea for progress on its human rights, humanitarian work in North Korea, and treatment of U.S. citizens being held in North Korea. He represented the United States in international organizations dealing with these issues. Prior to this, I first actually met Bob when he was a staff director for House Foreign Affairs Committee under Chairman Tom Lantos and Howard Berman. And prior to that was a senior professional staff member of the committee. He was concurrently chief of staff to Representative Tom Lantos and was also a member of the National Security Council in his earlier days working with Zbigniew Brzezinski in the Carter administration. Roberta Cohen is co-chair emeritus of the board of directors of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, otherwise known as HRNK. Her career has spanned the United Nations, the State Department, think tanks, the Brookings institutions, NGOs, and academia, where she has been a specialist in human rights, humanitarian, and refugee issues, and a leading expert on internally displaced persons, human rights in foreign policy, and human rights in North Korea. And then also joining us from Seoul, we're very, very happy to have the Honorable Ji Seong-ho, member of the National Assembly of the Republic of Korea, member of the People Power Party. He completed his bachelor's degree in law at Dongguk University and also completed a master's degree in criminal law at Dongguk University. He has been a member of the National Assembly, I have here since May of 2020, but also has been an advisor to the Ministry of Unification, has participated in the International Visitor Leadership Program that the State Department has run. Many of us have met with those groups that have come from Korea, and has been a winner of the Human Rights Award for the Hanwon-che Human Rights Foundation, as well as a Democracy Award from the National Endowment for Democracy. For those of you who follow this issue, of course, he became well known to Americans when he became one of the primary figures of North Korean human rights in past administrations. So we're very happy to have Congressman Ji with us. So I'm going to go to Roberta Cohen now for her thoughts on Bob King's book. Let me start by saying that we're very happy to have such an expert as Roberta joining us for this celebration of Bob's book. I think Bob deserves a lot of credit. I think one of the most important things that policymakers can do for posterity, for future students, for the record, is to write about their experiences. And I believe Bob did this while he was in residence at Stanford University at the Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford, and really has written a wonderful, wonderful book. So we're very grateful that he's done that for the scholarly community. Now, not only is he a human rights person and a veteran of Congress, we now count him among the ranks of scholars, although of course he was a scholar when he started. He has his PhD as well. So with that, let me turn it to Roberta Cohen. Roberta, thank you for joining us, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you, CSIS. I'm delighted to be part of a program introducing Ambassador Robert King's new book, which I have right here, a highly readable and well-documented account of his 8 years as Special Envoy. And I'm delighted to see Ji Seong-ho, and his picture is in my cell phone because I carry it around, and I'm so amazed always by his tremendous courage, commitment, and I'm very happy to see him in his office in Seoul. Bob King's book could not be more timely. The Biden administration will be reappointing an envoy for human rights, a position left vacant for the past 4 years. Ambassador King's experiences will prove instructive in demonstrating what can be done and what still needs to be done to promote respect for human rights in North Korea, enhance the monitoring, access, and transparency of humanitarian aid, develop solutions for refugees, and promote the free flow of information into and out of the country. That's a tall order from the North Korea Human Rights Act. Let's zero in on 4 ways the envoy found effective in carrying out these responsibilities. First, integrating human rights and humanitarian concerns into overall US policy toward North Korea. In fact, Bob bent over backwards to achieve this in light of the experience of his predecessor, the first envoy, who worked part-time from New York and was known to be publicly at odds with State Department officials, most notably the Secretary of State. Bob King's position, by contrast, became full-time with ambassadorial rank and tied closely to the East Asia Bureau at State. At the same time, Bob closely coordinated with all the other relevant bureaus, as well as with the USAID, Voice of America, and more. One result was the value in which the US government began to hold the position. Bob became the chief US negotiator in Pyongyang for humanitarian aid, the US official responsible for securing the release of an arrested American, a major player at the UN in mobilizing member states, and an important liaison with Congress, whose support was vital. A second effective way the envoy found to be very useful was to inject the issue into other questions. North Korean officials made clear straight away that they didn't like his title. Nonetheless, North Korea allowed him entry in 2011 to negotiate a humanitarian aid agreement. Bob King used the opportunity to negotiate stringent monitoring conditions to make sure that US food aid would not be diverted or distributed on a discriminatory basis to favored groups and areas of the country in line with North Korea's Sangbun system. Bob also used the occasion to raise repeatedly the case of an American detained for 6 months and was able to bring him home, finding that North Korea's interest in food aid made it ready to make a concession. Furthermore, Bob raised with North Korea's number 2 official in the foreign ministry the importance the US gave to the overall issue of human rights and how that could benefit North Korea. And with Chinese officials at the UN in a US-China discussion on political matters, he raised China's forced repatriation of North Koreans. This approach means that Were the US or allied governments in future to negotiate development aid to North Korea, they would inject fair labor standards and gender equality into the arrangement. And were economic investment ever to go forward in North Korea's mineral-rich areas, prison labor and forced labor would need to be part of the package. Third, utilizing the United Nations Forum so that human rights efforts become internationalized and legitimized. Although the DPRK has blamed the US's hostile policy for UN actions on human rights, Bob King points out that the argument falls flat when a substantial majority of UN member states vote against North Korea's human rights record in many different UN venues. The pressure emanating from the world's most prominent multilateral forum on North Korean human rights has actually produced some positive changes regarding North Korea's participation at the UN and its own practices, which makes it clear that there is benefit in working together with allies to maintain a united front for strong resolutions, the involvement of the Security Council, the implementation of the 2014 Commission of Inquiry report, and support for the Seoul UN office, which focuses on accountability. I would also note that the UN has been a venue where the US has been able to raise tough human rights issues. The political prison camps, forced labor, public executions, absence of due process, near absolute government control over free expression, information, religion, movement. To date, bilateral US-North Korean discussions have not encompassed most of those issues. Nor has the US, to my knowledge, urged the executive boards of UN agencies like the World Food Program, UNICEF, and the World Health Organization to request access to prisoners. There's humanitarian need. Prisoners are the most acute cases of hunger and disease in the country. Many are not expected to survive because of deliberate starvation and lack of medicines. Fourth, supporting a greater flow of information into North Korea. The book shows that a significant number of North Koreans are ready to take risks to listen to foreign radio broadcasts and watch foreign TV and movies on DVDs and USB drives. Were change to come to North Korea, the main catalyst would doubtless be the North Korean people learning how much better conditions are in South Korea and other countries and how unnecessary the poverty and tyranny in their own. The regime's increasing use of technology to control its population needs to be kept up with and countered. Let's now take a quick look at some of the challenging policy questions touched on in the book. One, can the envoy pursue both human rights pressure and engagement at the same time? Bob's strong endorsement of the COI report may have contributed, he says, to North Korea's cancellation of 2 of his planned trips to Pyongyang. But deference would have undermined US objectives at the UN and undercut the UN's actions. Bob, maybe you want to tell us about this high wire balancing act. 2, should humanitarian assistance go forward delinked from the political context in North Korea, as aid agencies sometimes advocate? In 2012, North Korea launched a long-range missile, which brought an end to a nuclear freeze agreement. But should the food aid separately negotiated have been provided? Bob argues it would not have been possible, and I agree with him. I also think food aid to North Korea should be conditioned in part on its own responsibility to invest more fully in agriculture and healthcare and to lift restrictions on aid workers. But whatever the US position, North Korea itself has regularly linked food aid to political and security issues. 3, should US travel restrictions to North Korea be eased to facilitate humanitarian operations and people-to-people exchanges? Bob favors this, but doesn't the trauma of the Otto Warmbier affair and repeated political detentions require negotiated assurances about the protection and treatment of Americans in Pyongyang? 4, should US support for information going into North Korea extend to balloon launches criminalized in South Korea? How can the approaches of Seoul and Washington be better coordinated in the information area? And finally, should the US seek a special negotiation with North Korea about human rights concerns? Although several former American presidents and other senior officials have paid visits to North Korea for different reasons over the years, they haven't engaged in what could be called a human rights discussion. Deliberately downplaying human rights, Bob King concludes, has never made North Korea more willing to accept limits on its nuclear weapons. Should incentives be offered? The former German ambassador to the DPRK recently suggested informing the North Koreans of the benefits to be accrued if they begin to open up and make progress on human rights. And what should US priorities be? Secretary Blinken recently mentioned family reunions. What about access for the UN Special Rapporteur and the ICRC? And the specific human rights highlighted, there are specific human rights issues highlighted in US legislation. Well, that's a lot to mull over. Thank you, Ambassador Robert King, for all you have done to advance human rights and also to advance the conversation with your new book.
Thank you, Roberta, for that wonderful review of Bob's book and also some pretty tough questions to Ambassador King. We expect nothing less from Roberta. So Bob, I'd like to go to you for some initial responses before we go to the Congressman Ji. We're very happy to see this book now in print. We know that you have been working on it for quite some time, and I think it's going to be considered sort of one of the absolute have to read texts when it comes to the question of North Korean human rights, up there with the UN Council of Inquiry, the COI Commission report on human rights. So Bob, again, thank you and welcome.
Thanks very much. And thank you very much, Victor, for providing this forum, this opportunity to talk about the human rights issues. And thanks especially to Roberta for her comments. Roberta is kind of like the angel sitting on the shoulder, reminding us what needs to be done. And as I was going through doing a lot of these things, I dealt with Roberta frequently when I was special envoy. One of the questions I would always ask is, now, what would Roberta say about this? So I appreciate your comments and I appreciate what you've done. A couple of things that I think are important to keep in mind in the context of the way human rights is played out. The first thing is that human rights became an issue not because it was the right thing to do, but because Congress pressed to have something done. It was the Congress that in 2004 adopted the North Korea Human Rights Act and called for the appointment of a special envoy, put certain benchmarks in place in terms of the administration, called for certain changes and so forth to be made. So I think it's particularly important to keep in mind that this is something that most administrations don't willingly jump into. This is something that they are dragged into by Congress because of legislation and because of congressional hearings. And I think that's an important element because it's an important part of our foreign policy and we need to make sure that it's part of that policy. I particularly appreciated the people I worked with in the State Department because of their recognition of the value and importance of the role of human rights in dealing with North Korea. And I had very good support, very strong support from my colleagues at the State Department on these issues. There unfortunately is an attitude that human rights gets in the way of progress on nuclear issues. And denuclearization has to be the first priority. Well, there's no question that the security issues are primary issues, but there's no indication whatsoever that if we avoid talking about human rights, we make progress on the nuclear issues. We haven't made progress on nuclear issues when human rights has not been raised. We haven't made progress on human rights issues when human rights has been raised. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. I think the value of the special envoy, as Roberta indicated, is that you have someone in the State Department who deals with people who are dealing with North Korean issues all the time, to look at how any issue might affect human rights questions with North Korea. And I think that's a particularly important aspect of why it helps to have a special envoy. It's important to have someone who looks and says, what are the human rights implications of doing something this way or doing something the other way? And I think that that makes it a very useful thing to have a person there who deals with those kind of issues. The other thing that I think is also important in terms of having the special envoy and the role of the special envoy is seeking allies and support with other countries. The United Nations has been one of the principal reasons we've made progress on human rights. And having someone who focuses on North Korea and the human rights issue, who participates in UN forum, in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, General Assembly in New York, and being able to raise the issue at the Security Council level has been very important in terms of moving North Korea in the right direction. And our involvement as the United States in these issues and in supporting them and pressing them has been, I think, something that's very useful. But I also made a point of trying to encourage support from European Union, from other governments that I dealt with. And I think all of these things are particularly important and useful in terms of increasing the focus on human rights, putting greater pressure on human rights issues. But thank you so much for your comments, Roberta, and thank you, Victor, for talking about this issue in this context.
Well, thank you, Bob, for those remarks and those responses. And we're going to go now to Congressman Ji Seong-ho. First, please, this is meant as an interactive forum, so we do have some questions coming in on the chat that we'll get to, but I just wanted to remind everybody, please send in your questions through the chat. Now, we're very honored to have the National Assemblyman Ji Seong-ho joining us. It's very late in Seoul, and I know that you're still in your office joining us, Congressman, so thank you so much. We're very honored and delighted that you could join us this evening. I'll turn the floor over to you.
네, 이제 로버트 킹 특사님 면책의 특권이라는 이제 저서를 이제 내신 것을 굉장히 기쁘게 생각하고 이제 축하드립니다.
Ambassador
King, congratulations on the publication of your new book.
예, 그리고 이제 빅터차 교수님 또 로버트 코엔 이제 선생님 뵙게 돼서 정말 기쁩니다.
And Senior Vice President Victor Cha and Dr. Cohen, I'm very pleased to meet you all, though virtually.
저는 이제 북한 인권 활동가 출신으로 국회의원을 지금 하고 있습니다.
I worked as an activist for North Korean human rights, and now I am working for the National Assembly of the Republic of Korea.
지금 북한 인권이 그 언제보다도 이제 심각한 상황에 있고, 또한 이제 북한 인권을 대한민국에서 핍박받고 있는 이런 상황은 저는 대한민국에 온 이후로 한 번도 본 적이 없는 그런 현실이 있습니다.
North Korean human rights conditions are very dire at the moment, and North Korean and activists working for North Korean human rights, actually, they are having a great difficulty at the moment, and this is something new. I haven't seen this kind of situation since I came to Korea.
그래서 그 어느 때보다도 이제 북한 인권을 향한 국제사회 협력이 더 중요하고, 그리고 북한 정권에게도 북한 인권의 문제점을 이제 제기함으로 인해 가지고 좀 인권의 침해는 언제 어디서든지 용납할 수 없다는 것을 좀 알려줄 수 있는 그런 기회가 필요한 것이죠.
I believe this situation requires the cooperation among the international community more than ever. We have to work together to continue to enhance human rights conditions in North Korea. And we also need to continue to raise this issue to the North Korean authorities. And we have to let them know that these dire situations and human rights violations and infringement cannot be tolerated.
예, 북한인권 대사, 미 국무부 북한인권 특사가 그 어느 때보다도 이제 필요한 시점이고 역할을 이제 기다리고 있는 현실입니다.
But that is why we are looking forward to having the ambassador position back after almost 4 years of absence, and we have high expectations for the role that he or she will play.
예, 이 시점에 로버트 킹 이제 특사님께서 저서를 출간해 주심으로 인해 가지고 미 국무부 또 미 백악관 그리고 북한 인권을 위해서 활동하는 모든 분들의 이제 지침서가 될 것이라고 저는 이제 생각합니다.
I believe your book, Ambassador King, will be a very important guideline for people working in the State Department and at the White House and human rights activists as well.
그리고 이 책은 한국 언론을 통해 가지고 대한민국 정부와 또한 이제 대한민국 여당에 주는 메시지도 분명히 있을 것으로 저는 이제 생각합니다.
And I believe your book will actually bring a lot of important messages to the Korean public as well, and it will also be important guideline for government officials.
예, 지금 참 이제 이제 북한 인권 이제 특사가 이제 필요한 시점이라고 제가 말씀드렸는데, 제가 인권 활동가가 아니고 정치인이 되었는데도 지금 이 환경이 너무나도 숨이 막혀요. 북한 주민들의 알 권리, 우리가 민주주의를 먼저 누리고 있는데 그 대북 전단 갈 수 없게 이제 대한민국에서 막았어요. 민주주의 국가인 대한민국에서 북한으로 갈 수 없도록 막았어요.
So like I said, we are in need of this critical role, which will be played by the Special Envoy for North Korean Human Rights, working for the State Department. And now I am working as a politician from a human rights activist. And the current environment is somewhat suffocating. It is really, the situation is really hard at the moment. I always thought that the people here in South Korea have been enjoying a great level of democracy, but the Korean government actually has stopped the spread of democracy. It stopped leaflet launches.
대한민국의 통일부라고 있습니다. 이제 그곳에서 이제 앞으로 활동을 일할 것에 대한 자료를 이제 냈는데, 그곳에 성과로 대북 전단 금지법을 한 것을 성과로 이제 만든 것을 보고 제가 이제 경악할 정도였어요.
Well, actually, there is a Ministry for Unification in Korea, and they submitted some documentation to the National Assembly of Korea. And they said in the report that the anti-leaflet law was one of the achievements. So I was appalled by the fact.
뭐 통일부 이제 장관이 이번에 미국 가려고 하다가 미국 뭐 조야에 만나 주실 분들이 딱히 없었는가는 모르겠습니다만 이제 취소된 것 같은데, 이번 기회에 만약 방문했다면 정말 민주주의를 택한 국가들에서 있을 수 없는 일을 하고 있는 것을 좀 더 이야기해 줄 필요가 있었다고 저는 생각됩니다.
So, well, actually, the Minister for Unification of Korea planned to visit the U.S. However, the trip was canceled. I don't know what happened behind the scene. However, if his visit happened, I believe that he should be advised that something that cannot happen in a democratic country actually happened in Korea.
예, 그 북한 인권 그 대북전단 금지법 지금 이제 헌법재판소에 가 있는 상황이고 또 이제 그것에 대한 판결을 기다려야 됩니다만 현재는 이제 그 전단을 보내면 또 USB를 보내면 성경책을 보내면 3년 이하의 징역, 3천만 원의 벌금을 받아야 되는 현실에 있습니다.
Actually, we have filed a lawsuit to the Constitutional Court of Korea against the anti-leaflet law, and we are waiting for the Constitutional Court ruling. However, at present, it is criminalized to send some leaflets to North Korea or USBs or Bible verses. So those who violate the law are faced with some jail term or a high level of fines.
예, 그뿐만 아니라 지금 이게 지금 대한민국의 정부에서 이제 법안 소위에 가져온 이제 그 법률안인데 여기에 보면 전자적 형태의 무체물 인도, 인수 및 정보통신망을 통한 송수신 등에 대해서 이제 차단하겠다는 이런 내용이 이제 들어 있습니다. 이것은 대북 라디오 방송에도 차단하겠다는 것으로 보여져 가지고 문제를 제기했고 지금 이 조항을 빼도록 제가 지금 노력 중에 있습니다.
Well, I'm showing you a copy of a bill submitted by the South Korean government, and it said that it will block sending some electronic signals to North Korea. It means that it will block the broadcasting sent to North Korea. So I tried to delete these provisions from this bill, so I'm working on it.
그래서 이것을 막는 일에 저도 노력하겠고 또 미국의 북한 인권 이제 특사 국무부에 빨리 나오고 그리고 저희가 함께 그래서 이제 연대해야 될 필요성이 이곳에 있다고 생각합니다.
So I'm gonna make my best efforts to prevent this bill to be passed by the National Assembly, and also I will look forward to having the U.S. North Korean Human Rights Ambassador very soon, and I look forward to working with him in solidarity.
감사합니다. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, National Assemblyman Ji, for those comments and for an update of what is happening now in South Korea with regard to legislation on North Korean human rights. It sounds like it's a very dynamic situation, and it deserves a lot of attention. And so thank you for raising that. So now I'd like to give Bob a chance to answer, Bob and Roberta and Congressman Ji, a chance to answer some questions from the audience. But before I do that, I thought, Bob, if I could ask you, first, do you know if your book is being translated into Korean?
Stanford apparently is in the process of arranging for the translation, and the plan is to have it published in Korean. So that is underway.
That's terrific. That's great to hear. And the other question I had is that National Assemblyman Ji mentioned that his hope was that they would eventually bring back the position in South Korea of the ambassador for human rights. Could you comment a bit about how you work? Because when you were in the position, there was a South Korean envoy for human rights, and if maybe you could comment a little bit on what your relationship was with that individual, how you worked together, whether you worked in parallel tracks or whether you met on your trips to Korea or that person's trips to Washington.
Initially, South Korea had an ambassador at large for human rights issues. And that person was not a career foreign ministry official, but usually an academic. The person who held that position was someone that I met with initially in Geneva, but also in South Korea and other places as we were in the same place together. When the South Korean Parliament established the National Assembly, when the National Assembly established the position of the special envoy or the ambassador for North Korea human rights, there was a much greater level of cooperation and coordination between the two of us. Ambassador Lee was a good friend. We had known each other earlier, and after he was appointed to this position, we met in Geneva, we met in New York, we met in Seoul, we met in Brussels. So it was a very helpful effort to have both the United States and South Korea actively advocating in a number of different forums. And I think it was a very helpful opportunity to have this focus on human rights that the position created.
And did you also have contact with other members of the other countries in the six-party talk? So did you go to talk with your interlocutors in Tokyo or in Beijing, other countries in the region about this particular issue, and how did they respond?
I felt like that was a very important part of what I needed to do, was make sure that countries that were most actively involved in North Korea issues, the six parties, were also aware of what our concerns were about human rights. I spent a lot of time with the Chinese. It was not terribly productive. It was frustrating in many cases. But I did meet with Chinese diplomats in United Nations context. I made a point of going to Beijing probably about once a year during the time I was special envoy. I would meet with North Korean officials who were involved with the United States on the North Korea issue. I also made a point of meeting with officials from the International Department of the Chinese Communist Party, because of the importance the party plays in terms of foreign policy issues, particularly with countries like North Korea, which are other communist countries. But I think it was important to raise issues with the Chinese government. Issue of particular concern was the difficulty of defectors, of refugees leaving North Korea, passing through China, and then being able to go to South Korea or a few elsewhere. And it was, I think, important for the Chinese to hear from the United States that this was an issue of concern to us. The Chinese were never terribly responsive. Their argument was that defectors were primarily economic defectors and not ideological, and therefore they needed to be returned to North Korea. I raised the issue, I pressed them on it. I made visits to Northeast China, to the border areas. But it was important to let the Chinese know that this was a priority with the United States. And I think it was helpful to have that message out there.
Thanks. And I actually have a question for all three of our guests today. That shifts a little bit more to the humanitarian situation. It appears as though the North Korean government's concerns about the transmission of the COVID virus has caused them to basically shut down their border with all countries, including China. And I just wanted to get a sense from each of you what your read of that situation is. It seems like that border has been closed, I think, since January of 2020. Any comments or thoughts you have on what is going on now in North Korea with regard to the virus? So, Bob, if you'd like to start, and then maybe I'll go to Congressman Ji, and then to Roberta. So, Bob.
There are real problems in part because of the COVID pandemic and the tight shutdown in North Korea. Conditions were getting difficult before that because the United States was making it more difficult for American citizens to go to North Korea in partial reaction to some of the problems with Otto Warmbier and other Americans who were being detained. But it's not possible for humanitarian assistance to be provided unless there's an opportunity for the government or for the private organization involved in humanitarian efforts to be there on the ground to see what conditions are, to make sure that they're shipping the right kind of products to North Korea, to make sure that they're going to the right individuals. And the difficulty, the North Koreans have always been difficult in terms of wanting to control any kind of humanitarian aid that's provided, but it's become increasingly difficult because of the travel restrictions before COVID, and now because of the pretty much total ban on travel by foreigners into North Korea. I think it's led to a heavy toll on North Korean citizens who would benefit from some of this kind of assistance. But that, I think, is a real problem.
Thank you. Congressman Ji, do you have any thoughts about what's going on with regard to COVID in North Korea?
예. 예. 그 북한이 이제 북중국경을 철저하게 차단한 건 사실이고요. 그로 인해서 현재 북한 안에 이제 물가라든가 이런 것들이 가격이 이제 치솟아 가지고 북한 주민들이 어려움을 겪고 있는 것은 사실입니다.
Like you said, the border with China has been closed for the past year or so, and prices within North Korea actually have spiked because of that. That's why North Korean residents, they are having a great difficulty. Actually, this situation has taken a great toll on the livelihoods of North Korean people.
물가가 올라가는 그 원인은 뭐 북한의 뭐 식량이 부족한 것도 있겠습니다만, 북한이 이제 생산품들을 만들지 못하고 중국이 한 70% 이상을 의존하다 보니까 국경이 막히니까 뭐 심지어 이제 볼펜 같은 것도 뭐 어디 뭐 유통이 되기 어렵다든가 무슨 라면 하나 같은 것도 이제 어려운 이제 그런 상황이 되다 보니까 이제 더 어렵게 된 거죠.
Have risen significantly. It has something to do with lack of food available in North Korea, but it has more to do with North Korea's heavy reliance, dependence on its trade with China. Actually, they rely upon China for 70% of their products. So at the moment, like everyday goods like ballpoint pens, or instant noodles, they are hard to get by for North Korean citizens at the moment.
특히 이제 북한에 그 코로나 환자가 있냐 없냐를 이제 정확하게 알기 위해서 제가 여러모로 이제 애썼고, 최근 2월 달에 이제 북한의 헤엄쳐 넘어온 탈북민이 있습니다. 제가 며칠 전에 하나원에 가가지고 그 친구를 만나가지고 2월 16일 탈북하기 전까지 북한에 코로나 환자가 있었냐 없었냐에 대한 이제 질문을 했었는데, 그 당시까지는 코로나 환자는 이제 뭐 확인된 것을 뭐 일부 지역이겠습니다만 그 친구는 보지 못했다, 이런 이제 대답을 듣기도 했습니다.
So there are questions about whether there are COVID cases in North Korea at the moment. Actually, I tried hard to figure out whether there are indeed cases in North Korea. In fact, back in February, on February 16th, there is one North Korean defector. Actually, he swam and across the border, and he is now staying at a North Korean defectors support center, called Hanawan at the moment. And I asked him whether whether he has heard of COVID cases in the north. Of course, he cannot have like all knowledge about all the cases in that country, but as far as he's concerned, he said that he hasn't heard of any cases, COVID cases in North Korea.
뿐만 아니라 여러 이제 그 최근에 온 탈북민들 이제 만나서 이야기를 들어봤는데 탈북을 그러니까 어려우니까 탈북을 하고 싶은데 탈북을 못하는 이유가 지금 이제 문재인 그 대통령과 김정은이 사이가 너무 좋으니까 남한으로 내려가면 대한민국 군인들이 자기들을 체포해서 북한으로 올려보낼 것이다. 북송시켜서 우리는 죽을 것이다. 이런 이제 공포를 갖고 있는 것도 지금 현실이라는 점에서 굉장히 충격을 받았어요.
Talked with a number of North Korean defectors, and in fact, they are fearful of the current situation. Especially, actually, they wish to flee from North Korea because the situation is so dire in North Korea at the moment, but they cannot. And one of the reasons is that the relationship between President Moon and Chairman Kim is really good at the moment. So they are afraid that South Korean soldiers might arrest them and repatriate them to North Korea so that they could be killed. So they have this real fear that they might be repatriated if they attempt to defect to South Korea.
뿐만 아니라 한 가지를 제가 더 물어봤었는데 북한의 한류 문화가 어느 만큼 확산됐는지, 만약 북한의 평양의 이제 고위층이 뭐 평양에 살던 사람에게 물었는데 고위층이 남한 드라마도 마음대로 보고 영화도 보고 그리고 여권을 주면 그 여권 가지고 워싱턴 DC도 가는 그런 이제 자유를 이제 북한의 2030 평양 청년들이 원하냐, 아니면 그 계속해서 세습을 하니까 그런 특권계층으로 계속 사는 것을 원하냐 하는 질문도 제가 던졌는데 그 친구의 답이 북한의 2030 청년들도 남한 드라마를 보고 지금 이제 보고 사는 것을 원하고 특권계층을 내려놓더라도 이런 자유를 이제 원한다, 이런 이제 좀 충격적인 이야기도 듣기도 했습니다.
Interpreter, I think you're muted.
Yes, I've also asked about the current state of the Korean wave in the north, and in fact, my question was about the youngsters whose family is prestigious, from a prestigious family, and they are enjoying Korean dramas and Korean films, and I asked them whether they want to stay in Pyongyang and continue to enjoy this level of prestige within that society, but they said even though they have to actually give up on their privileges as a high level elite, as an elite in North Korea, they want to have some kind of freedom.
예, 그래서 이제 그 문재인 정부 들어서 이제 북한 인권 대사를 임명하지 않고 있어서 저도 국회에서 외교부, 대한민국 외교부에 계속 이제 항의를 하고 지적을 하는데 개선의 기미가 보이지 않고 미국과 이제 한국의 북한 인권 특사가 빨리 만들어져서 자유를 찾아오고 싶어하는 사람들이 무서워서 한국 정부가 무서워서 한국군이 무서워서 못 온다, 이런 이야기가 나오지 않도록 이제 노력해야 될 이유라고 저는 생각합니다.
So actually, during the Moon Jae-in government in South Korea, we don't have any special envoy for North Korean human rights in Korea. So at the National Assembly, I have continued to urge the Korean government to appoint the North Korean human rights envoy in South Korea. However, so far there is no sign to appoint such a position in South Korea. So I look forward that we're going to have special envoy for North Korean human rights, both in Korea and the US very soon, so that we can work closely together and that we can prevent the situation where North Koreans who want to leave their country cannot defect from North Korea for fear of South Korean government.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Now let me go to Roberta. Roberta, if I could also ask you, we're getting a lot of questions in the chat, and a number of them are addressing a similar question, which is, you know, whoever the U.S. Special Envoy for North Korean human rights will be, and so one is they're asking who will it be. That's the first part, and then, but I know you don't have a crystal ball, so I don't expect you can answer that. But the other is whether you think that the incoming the U.S. Special Envoy, so Bob King's successor, should address some of the concerns that National Assemblyman Ji has raised with regard to, you know, legislation in South Korea, the anti-North Korean leaflet law, this whole question about a radio broadcast, possible regulation of radio broadcasting into North Korea. So I guess, I mean, please feel free to comment on the COVID humanitarian situation, but if you have any thoughts on what you think the agenda should be for the incoming Special Envoy for Human Rights for the Biden administration.
Victor, I lost the sound on toward the end of what you were asking me, but I think I got the gist of it. Do you hear me?
Yes.
I'm not sure why I'm having trouble hearing you, but let me go back just for a moment to the COVID situation, because the isolation that North Korea has felt was necessary in order to get through the pandemic. It also involves many different human rights questions, because the shoot to kill, the closing of the borders, the repression, a lot of censorship, a lot of rulings. It's you can really see how a centralized and really tyrannical regime can deal with this. The dire situation, as Bob King pointed out, was dire before the pandemic. I mean, if you looked at the statistics on food insecurity for nearly half the country, and whether it's water, sanitation, and many other basic needs. So this really has put it on edge. But when you see the total lack of transparency, I find it very hard to believe there's no COVID case in the country. And yet this idea that there aren't any, I mean, I'd be very pleased to know there aren't any, but it's very hard to believe that. And then the withdrawal and restrictions on all the humanitarian workers, so that I think just about all of them have left. So there isn't anybody from the outside there. They want to be, they want to help, and they're not able to. Now, the vaccine situation also raises certain questions. They want to get vaccines from different countries, and they need to do this, and they want to vaccinate the population. But when you have a country like North Korea, and there are limits on how many vaccines you can get, who actually is going to get vaccinated? Those who are politically loyal? Is this the opening to a very discriminatory situation of who will get this? Because we know that the system has worked, the public distribution system, you can just look in the UN Secretary General's reports, is so discriminatory that the UN and others suggest don't use the North Korean public distribution system. But how will the vaccines be disseminated? So that's an issue that I think ought to be looked at. And I don't know, though, in the absence of international humanitarian groups with some sort of standards and look at how things should be distributed, how this will actually work out if it's just within this isolated sphere. So there's more to say, but let me just refer people to some of the reports that come out, I think from Human Rights Watch, about how the human rights situation is impacted by the way North Korea deals with the pandemic. With regard to the special envoy and with regard to South Korea, I mean, I think an effort was made by the United States and South Korea in their joint statement to deal with differences they've had on how to deal with North Korean human rights. When we look at the leaflets issue, it's a bigger issue than that. I see it as, what does it mean? What is the cost of engagement? South Korea wants to engage with North Korea. What is the price that you pay for this? And I think that price is very high, and I find it way too high. But it's not just leaflets. I mean, it's intimidation of groups in South Korea that deal with North Korean human rights, and intimidation of groups that have involved in them former North Korean defectors. It has to do with what they do with the United Nations, where they don't co-sponsor resolutions on human rights that they used to. So that in 2019, 2020, suddenly South Korea is not a co-sponsor of the leading resolution at the UN on human rights in North Korea. How does that look to the entire international community? What is the message that you're getting? And then many other examples of whether it's sending back North Koreans to the North. There was a terrible case where 2 people were sent back to the North very quickly. And this all brings up what is the cost of engagement. And here, I thought it was very good that the United States and South Korea agreed in their joint statement to work together to improve the human rights situation in North Korea and have it done in some sort of lockstep way. What is that actually going to mean in terms of their policies? Because there's a disarray at the UN, and that shouldn't be. But to what extent the United States will come involved in trying to influence the policies South Korea takes within its own country. After all, it's a thriving democracy, and it has a free press, and it has ports, and it has media. And so I don't know the extent to which the United States will get involved. They've never expressed support for what's being done on these leaflets. They've never expressed agreement on any of the intimidation of these groups. I think members of Congress have been quite the opposite, very critical of it, hold hearings. There is a reference to freedom of expression in the joint statement of the United States and of President Biden and Moon. And that may suggest that maybe there will be discussions or follow-up on this, because certainly the view of South Korea, an ally and supposed to be a democratic ally, is failing, is going down a bit because of this. But I think the bigger issue and the more important one is to decide what you're going to do to engage with North Korea and the price you pay. And at what point does compromise really become a kind of capitulation that is not in your interest, and that it wouldn't be in US or South Korean interest?
Thank you, Roberta. So we only have about 40 seconds left. And I want to go to Bob King for the last word on this. Bob, if you'd like to comment on any of what's been discussed so far. And then one of the questions, we addressed a lot of the questions in the discussion, but one of them that came in, I thought I'd ask you if you want to offer even just brief thoughts on it, which is, during your years of work in the human rights field, were there ever moments when you felt like there was no solution? And how did you find meaning in your work during those times? So Bob, over to you for the last word.
It's an interesting question because there's no issue about it being a frustrating issue to deal with. The North Koreans are not anxious to make progress. Some US administrations have been less than enthusiastic about human rights. The thing that I think more than anything when I was special envoy that encouraged me is the knowledge that this was the right thing to do. Human rights are something that everyone should be entitled to. And it was frustrating as hell sometimes to deal with these issues. But at the same time, I always felt, and I still feel, that this is the right thing to do. Human rights isn't something that we ought to do because it's going to help our relationship with North Korea, because it's going to improve the politics. It's the right thing to do. And that, I think, above all, was one of the things that really led me to feel like it was worth the effort and worth the frustrations to deal with the problems that we were dealing with on North Korea. It was frustrating to see the changes that took place in the United States. The fact that no special envoy was appointed, that human rights was largely ignored by the previous administration. It was frustrating to see some of the same changes taking place in North Korea in an effort to try to engage with the North Koreans. I think human rights has got to be an issue on its own. We have to do the human rights issues in spite of the fact that sometimes they create difficulties. It's the right thing to do. People deserve to have the right to freedom of speech, to the civil liberties that we expect and enjoy. And I think that's the only thing that we need to keep in mind in terms of moving forward.
Thank you. Well, that's a very good way to end our discussion. I want to thank Ambassador King for his service for many years on this issue, as well as this wonderful book. I want to thank Roberta Cohen for joining us with a terrific review of the book and a wonderful discussion. And of course, I want to thank National Assemblyman Ji. Again, it's very late in Korea. 대단히 감사합니다. We're very happy to see you. And with that, thank you, everybody. The book is called Patterns of Impunity, published by Stanford Asia Pacific Research Center. So thank you all very much and have a good day. Have a good evening.